Age has always been a hot button issue in dynasty circles, and we're going to discuss how to find that balance for your dynasty roster and your approach. That and more this week on the Football Guys Dynasty Show. And Jordan, age is one of the 3 or 4 subjects that basically you could be diametrically opposed with other league mates, and it really does define you in some form or fashion to how you think about player value.
Yeah, it's just a number. Age ain't nothing but a number. So I do think it matters. We see it pop up in different ways, right? And I think that if you understand age, you can make better bets. Not necessarily to say which one is right, but better informed bets. We see age bleed in a lot to the market in terms of how people value players, and it actually makes guys cheaper that are older, right? I mean, that's something that we see over and over again. So that's something that I've come to lean more on, especially guys like mid-career. Earlier on in my dynasty career, I'd be really scared of guys mid-career, right? Maybe that's Keenan Allen from a couple of years ago type mid-career, right? Now still like I would say he's on the back end of that middle part of his career. But sort of in that sort of vein, right? Mid-20s into the later part of the 20s. I used to be out on that because I was like, oh, it's too old. But really, like it's the perfect blend now of cheap and productive, right? To me. And so blending those two things, I think you have to understand what you're trying to accomplish. And if you're willing to sort of go a little bit different way, there's plenty of opportunity and value to be had.
Yeah, it really feels like we could have an age discussion in macro every month on the show. And frankly, we would keep going in different directions and discuss different things. And I think that it's always relative to what the price is, and seeing how certain ages and certain players, the erosion happens differently. And it's very interesting on if a player already had some lack of appeal in the marketplace, it's interesting how age becomes an issue earlier. Like Brandon Cooks has long since not had respect, and yet he's younger than a lot of people think. And people already kind of value him almost like Adam Thielen, right? I mean, and yet they're about, 3-4 years different in age at this point. So it's interesting to see things like that versus, some players stay relatively insulated for long. So for me, the two positions where I'm pretty agnostic, and I'd be interested if we have a discussion about one of the other positions, but wide receiver and quarterback, I just think it's tough to get right. And so if you're going to be picky with age too, I need a player that I already am really sure that they're good enough to have a job, hold a job, produce with the job. And then you're going to say, but they can't be this old or older to get on this ride. Like, you must be this tall to ride this roller coaster. I'm like, your subset is so small. So many of your teams are going to be displeased at the position because you're going to have something you don't like. Or my fear is, if we approach this differently, that everybody is going to go say that I have to just go younger and hope I get it right, as opposed to being older. No, I'm right, but I just might not be right for very long. I think those are the two sort of risk factors, right? You get the older player. I know you're good, but it's just a matter of how long you're going to hold on and stay good. Keep your claws on that 18-wheelers that's going down the highway. Or if you're too young, well, will you ever break out? Will you become Cortland Sutton? Will you become that player that never really gets all the way home? But hey, you're young, but yet we still don't know. Are you actually dynasty and NFL good?
Totally right. It's the balance, and I mean, you become right, and that's what makes young and elite really valuable, right? That's what makes Justin Jefferson really valuable. That's what makes Jamar Chase, right? Again, I could quibble a little bit on the Chase angle, just because I don't think it's as safe as everyone wants to think it is. But Jefferson and the like, I mean, that's why Mahomes and Superflex and Allen, right? These guys that
if you get a
Herbert,
5-year run of a position where you're like, oh, lock and load from age 22 to 27, I mean, it's gold, baby. It's gold,
right?
and
Totally.
hard to find though. Very hard to find.
Yeah. Totally agree with that. And so, but like you said, like you kind of have to balance it at points, right? You want to go, right, the Cortland Sutton angle, right? The Jerry Jeudy, right? I mean, is a guy who has not really broken out yet, that is still getting all sorts of love. We're just going to
But
call
these
it
are cautionary tales. Yeah.
Totally. And so when you look at these, then you sort of flip it around and you say, hey, there's guys that consistently beat ADP, right? And, I was called out last week for mentioning the same player's name, so we'll go different angles. Brandon Cooks, not a receiver from Tampa Bay, right? Keenan Allen, like those type of guys can beat ADP pretty consistently, right? Because they're quote priced past their age. And I mean, I think you can get those things right. What's interesting to me is when people try to get right age-wise from a value perspective, because I think the market, and the more and more I study this, the more and more I don't trust the market to sort of stay consistent year over year, because it's fickle. And what the dynasty trade market and the dynasty startup market really reacts to is prior production, right? A ton of that is prior of last season's production. And that's can be really scary if you're trying to say, oh, these guys are insulated because they're young, when in reality, that's a part of it, but the market's going to make a big time reaction to them flubbing or them breaking out, right? Those things I think are much more out of your control than picking profiles that are productive and leaning into it from that angle. So I do think it's a delicate balance. You don't want guys that are, that you don't want everyone 33 years old or above, but at the same time, I think that there's plenty of ways to replenish your roster at a discount on the and not have to pay premium prices for guys that haven't done it yet, and still remain, and still cycle through your roster, but do it in a way that is less risky and expensive.
Yeah, the most maddening thing I've done, and I'm never gonna undo it, but it's gonna be one of those like BC AD type scenarios with my rankings, because I sit here on my Excel sheet, and the thing I added was literally their adjusted points per game finish by year. And now seeing some of those on the differentials on player profiles, where it's like, so why are these two apart? Either it's in my rankings or by general market consensus. But like, for example, I mean, some of these profiles where you look and they're very similar, and yet why are they different when there's a lot of similarity? Like AJ Brown and DK Metcalf have been pretty tied at the hip every year of their career, and yet they're pretty far apart. Like DK Metcalf saw a little bit of a bump down. AJ Brown, though, can do no wrong, and he's insulated. Like, what's going on there? So it's very much, it's easy to see arbitrages in that capacity. Like, I don't understand why T Higgins is not valued like CeeDee Lamb. Or sorry, I guess I should say CeeDee Lamb is valued like T Higgins, or whichever way you want to say it, because they've been very similar. And yet you would think CeeDee Lamb is on his way to being great, and T Higgins is on his way to just being okay. Is sort of based on how they look. So that, again, it will forever change sort of how easy it is for me to see discrepancies, whether it's in my own rankings and maybe having a personal discussion with myself about, like, why are these different? Should they be different? Should they be this far apart or a tier different? And same thing goes with the market. I was actually thinking about this by position. I almost wanted to do a rapid fire, Jordan, of how we kind of think of age, because that balance on your dynasty teams, I personally don't really think of it in the aggregate of my team. Like, okay, I have 25 players and I need X amount of them below this age. I can only have 3 or 4 older guys per se. Like, I don't think of it that way. I almost think of the blended approach of, I'm okay at quarterback and wide receiver generally being on the older side. Like, if all my quarterbacks are over 30 years old, I'm fine with that. If all but maybe one wide receiver are over 25, 26 years old, I'm fine with that. So I would wonder, is there anything that you would kind of adapt or change to that of your approaches at those two positions?
No, I think that's good. I think another way to think about it too is, especially at wide receiver, you kind of layering the position depending on how deep you are, right? Depending on how many guys that you have, right? Some of the guys at the bottom of that depth chart can be some younger bets, right? You can make a little bit different investment there. You can take on a little bit more risk with wide receivers 6, 7, and 8, right? That's probably not a spot where you want to roster Jarvis Landry. You'd rather take a shot on, this year's version of Kadarius Toney, right, at that part of your roster. So I think that part of it matters too. But by and large, there's plenty of times each year, and this is something I've really adopted. I won't take the first wide receiver off in a rookie draft anymore, right? I'm taking the last of profiles, right? I'm taking Kadarius Toney, right? I'm waiting on Kadarius Toney. I'm waiting on Brandon Ayuk from a couple years ago, right? Instead of going up and spending a round higher on Bateman or, even it was a lot more on Chase. But I think the Justin Jefferson, Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, Jalen Reagor class is instructive, right? When you look at those guys, it was Justin Jefferson was the clear 4, and he's been the best by far, right? And I think when you start looking at those, right, we struggle to get those situations right. So that's the way you can really build in some youth and some growth opportunity at those cheaper costs, and maybe take 2 of those bets instead of 1. Right. I think those ways, and that's not expensive, right? That doesn't cost you a lot, right? That's your sort of upside shot. Whereas higher on the depth chart, I want more security, right? And I think it does matter a little bit, by position. Tight end, you could do a variety of different angles at tight end. You want to just figure out a way to try and take an elite shot at tight end is what I would say. And it's because by and large, it's pretty replaceable after the top 5 or 6 guys. It's a really flat tier. So just try and figure out ways to take elite shots would be my angle there. So it does get a little bit different by position and by cost in particular.
Yeah, and I think again at wide receiver and tight end at the top for sure, it's hard enough to get it right that I think so many people worry, myself 5 to 10 years included ago, that you're worried about a guy retiring on your roster. You're worried about turning into nothing. I got 0. Last year I could have got a late second, and he wouldn't have died on my roster. Well, you wouldn't have used him in your lineup. Like, he was still viable at that point in time. And I think that's something that's lost. Like, you spend 210 on just rookie X. Do they ever start, a predictable season for you in an entirety kind of look? And the answer to that is probably no. Probably not, especially if you're spending at those positions, tight end or wide receiver. I mean, when are they going to give you? And so that's the thing of, like, if they erode, if Travis Kelce, let's pretend from this point on, Travis Kelce goes the way of someone like Jason Witten, that it got to the point if he was a lower wide receiver 1. Well, he was still a guy you plug and played into his mid-30s. He was still a guy that I believe was in the top 15 or 16 that last year. Didn't he come out of retirement? He was still PPR viable. Was it pretty? No. Was it on par with 37-year-old Tony Gonzalez or whatever? Probably. But the point is, they were still relevant. And so you say, well, at that point, they're worth a 3rd-round pick. But note that it slides all the way from, say, Travis Kelce is still worth a top 5 pick now, and then next year it's worth a later first, then it's worth a second at 33 or 34 years old. You see where I'm going here? Like, every step of the way, you go, I still kind of like what I got, and you say no to the pick. So what I'm like, every year it becomes a different cost analysis, but as long as that strong historical player keeps churning it out, you go, kind of like what I have. Like, why would I just take 204 for a player that I can still put in my lineup? So you keep doing this over and over again at positions like that's why I think it's a little easier in the passing game to say no to just age in a vacuum of, like, I need to get younger. Because, like, I mean, Jerry Jeudy through 2 years hasn't fixed anything. Like, if you say, I got to get younger, and you trade Adam Thielen plus something for Jerry Jeudy, let me get younger, well, your lineup lost. So that's the tough part of it, is you still need to outproduce your peers to go somewhere in the regular season of the playoffs.
Totally. And you put something out, earlier this week about, about, and it prompted me to talk about the winning dynasty trades in March versus winning dynasty games in October, right? And you're 14-2 or whatever it was, you're 12-2 in dynasty trades in the offseason, and then you're 2-12 in the regular season. And what have you accomplished, right? Jerry Jeudy is the case in point of that, right? What are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to make a pretty roster? Are you trying to make one that wins Twitter polls? Are you trying to win one that is attractive to other trade candidates? Or are you trying to win, right? Because those different names, we can give you different advice to do different things. And I think that you have to answer that question. What are you trying to accomplish, right? What are you trying to do with your team? And that'll sort of indicate to you how to think about this question. I think you and I come down on the let's win, right? Let's try and win games, because that's the most, if we can put points out there, that's the most predictable thing. I can't really predict what other people a year from now are going to think about player X in a trade. I can't do that, right? But we can tell you, hey, here's some odds that you can think about in terms of the production. I think that's a better way to go. And that's a game I've played more now, right? I've used to try and play that value game more and more. Let's just try and pick winning players now, and we'll figure out what other people think about it later on down the line.
Yeah, and one thing I've noticed being a couple years into doing more of this is that I've made a lot more strategic trades, and maybe the volume is lower. Because one thing is, you get core level guys on your roster or profiles you believe in, you're not likely to trade those away. Because if they see any market erosion and you say, well, I already like this player, I already like their spot and their utility on my team, there's not really a reason to trade them away. So your total possible asset class of who can I trade away realistically versus the market is lower than it once was. So the realistic deals might be flip players. They could be ancillary running backs, but heck, in October, you might use those guys. It might be, again, I think rookie picks as a tool, whether you're picking or trading, becomes one of the more obvious ones that you need to sit down and have a discussion with yourself about, a strategy session of what could I get? Am I interested in that? Do I want to, you can wait all the way till being almost on the clock and still exploring trades for veteran types or even younger players that you may prefer over the prospect, and you may end up taking the prospect. But I do think that wherever you are in the first, second, third round, that you have options. And I don't think enough people, and we have 3 more months in rookie draft season to talk about this, but I don't think enough people sit there and say, okay, I have 106. What can that buy me in the market? You don't have to make a move today, but I don't think enough people explore what that could buy you. And they automatically are just so centered and entrenched in the mindset of, what rookie am I taking? Let me stack up the board. Here's the 6 guys, and I'm going to get one of these 6. Or man, I really see a top 4, big tier of 4, and I need to get to 104 now. Like, they think of it that way, and I really think it's backwards, because 106 might get you a guy that so leaps and bounds better as a profile than what you're likely to get even in the first 24 months of that rookie that probably isn't turning into the next great elevating, year one breakout type guy. That, again, market value be damned. I mean, because if you don't get a producer, you surely want a young player that is still liquid enough to trade for a producer. I would venture a guess, if things aren't going the way you like for a couple of years.
Yeah. And go ahead.
I was saying, this is Chad Parsons, Jordan McNamara, episode 92 of the Football Guys Dynasty Show. And the last point I would make on this is that running back, I think you just have to go towards situations. And like with a lot of these, the volume approach, I mean, we're looking at backups. There's only, probably 25 to 30 clarified jobs, going into a year or during a year. So, I mean, there are some profiles, but that becomes pretty fleeting to say I have to have 25 and under, a guy with a job and contract security and all that stuff. So it really is, just like some of these other positions, a very small subset of having it all, quote unquote. And running back is a little more fickle than the others.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think too, I look at the age is less of a factor for me at running back. I tend to look more at contract security, right? Because injury can crop up and really, at 25 years old can debilitate a guy just as easy as it can at 29. So I tend to look at a little bit more, age matters as a sort of a tiebreaker, but if everyone's on a 1-year deal, right, I think that's risky for everybody, right? So I kind of value that a little bit more. 2 or 3 years of longevity. There's not many guys that have 2 or 3 years of longevity, if we're being totally honest, in terms of contractual security. Outside of some rookie deals, like 3 years is a ton of commitment in terms of the contracts, even ones that look 5-6 years. It's not really that. So I tend to really value that because there's so much bad that can happen. I like to have a little bit of wiggle room to kind of know what maybe the next 18 months of a guy's career is going to look like. And if he's going to be a cut candidate at the end of the year, right, that cliff comes quicker, I think, in terms of both value and production, and there's a lot more risk there. So I tend to look at that a little bit differently. And then again, I'll take, and sort of, we'll use age as a tiebreaker, but then there becomes a lot of guys that look very similar this year, similar age ranges, similar securities. And then I think it's just, I'll take 2 of them, or I'll wait and take one cheaper, right? I sort of very much do that, especially in flat tiers. So I kind of view running back a little bit more nuanced than some of the other positions when it comes to all that.
Yeah, I totally agree there. And really, especially when you get that year 1 or year 2 hit, and they have that, especially a first rounder has another couple of years plus the 5th-year option. I mean, that's about as insulated at running back as you possibly can get, because that second contract comes at a pivotal time for guys. It'll be 24, 25, 26 years old. Actually, maybe sometimes drifting to 27, where they're finally out there with an extension or moving on to a new team with some level, DeMarco Murray, I kind of think of with some level of allegiance, where then you're already on the age cliff, at least prime window of production. So running back really is the one where even a strong profile, like you said, I mean, 2-3 years is the absolute max, and that's if it's a 22, 23-year-old that got started early and often with that production. Do you want to remind folks, look like a champion with some of your Football Guys official gear and merchandise. You got that classic Black Eyed Joe logo. Jordan already has some gear he's been sporting on the show. If you've been watching on YouTube on the live shows and recorded ones over on YouTube, quality design, materials, you get your hats, shirts, outerwear, coffee cups, all that and more over at shop.footballguys.com. We're going to center on some FFPC trades this week. And the first one, talk about an older running back that still holding some pretty good value. It's Mr. Derrick Henry. And talking about 1-2 year windows, FFPC is kind of the perfect format. It's a hybrid keeper / some redraft elements there. So Derrick Henry was traded for 103 this year and 1 quarterback and a 23 second. So what do you think, Jordan, about Henry's chances of maybe being on a multi-year window, or do you have to view him as more of a 1-year play versus 103 in a relatively tepid class?
I think that it's probably closer to a 1-year deal than we might otherwise think. If you actually look at the numbers, it's probably closer to 2, right? But I actually think that he could be in a decline phase. I'm taking the shot on Henry though at the cost. Like, he's a guy that can make a difference, I think. And you're getting a rookie pick. It's probably going to be a receiver in that range. I mean, I like the Henry side of this because I think he can, and if he's right, I think he can make a big time difference. And I'm not sure you're going to get that angle on that. The one thing that I would ask, my only caution about a deal like this and about making deals from picks to players right now is that you tie up your liquidity. So you're not able to make a better deal at some point along the line. So I do think you have to be cautious with that, right? Someone was asking, hey, do I trade a third for this wide receiver, that kind of blends in? I said, well, you can't use that later on, right? You can't use that. And so I just start to think at this time of year, addressing situations like when Zeke got suspended, like when Tyreek Hill had his legal trouble, like when not probably super topical on this specific trade, but for this concept, a Deshaun Watson deal. You don't necessarily want to tie up your picks in your flexibility when you could address those situations in a buy low scenario at some point between now and the draft if something happens, right? Alvin Kamara has already happened. If there's other situations like this, if there's other trades or retirements or holdouts, all those things, when you don't have the pick right, and you have a player, you've instantly shrunk the universe in which you can make that deal. So that would be the thing that I would have a little bit of pause on at this particular time in the calendar. I think ultimately, though, I like the Henry side over the pick.
Yeah, I always think of, well, 103 should get you a lot of places. And, I usually play volume, and I know in FFPC it's kind of tough. I mean, volume might be 7 or 8 running backs at absolute maximum. And in other formats, you might be able to go 10 plus, 12 plus. So that's one limitation. But I was thinking 103. I mean, now maybe just to clarify something you said, you alluded to the fact that Derrick Henry could be next year a difference maker. So I guess I would charge and ask that, I mean, couldn't you get Austin Eckler plus for 103? I mean, I don't know if he's going to haul that much, and you're finding similar upside. You're maybe a little bit you're there. Even if you don't view Ezekiel Elliott as having the same upside, but he certainly would be cheaper. I think Josh Jacobs would certainly be cheaper. So I think there's a lot of angles where if you're just going profile shopping, and I think the thing you said is correct, which is you better get what you consider a slam dunk. So if 103 plus a second for Henry to you is considered a slam dunk, then yeah, you execute it this early. But we're still before the cut, for example, and those are free roster spots. But I just think you aim high, right? I mean, 103 might get you whoever you view as high. I mean, could you give 103 and a second or whatever additional stuff and go, well, let me go hunting, right? I mean, to use one of your phrases, let me go hunting for, can I get McCaffrey? Can I get, can I just go big? I mean, you can get a year or two younger with Joe Mixon, for example. I just think if you're willing to spend that high of a pick on a running back, I think you have a lot more options than just say, pigeonhole and put blinders on and say, I need to get Derrick Henry. I think this was probably Derrick Henry was on the block or was suggested by the other team. And this was the settled on price. It wasn't 103 hunting around and shopping the 103 specifically.
Now that you say that, as you sort of lay out that context of it, I think you're right. And I would probably, I think you're probably right in terms of how this deal came about. So I would, if I'm sitting here with this, right, I think Derrick Henry probably beats the pick, right? In terms
we approached this wrong. Like we assumed that this was 103 shopping it around, and I mean, now discussing it, I don't think either of us think that. But we did say you should, if you're shopping it around, legitimately shop it around and aim high with top running backs. And I know Henry is top 8 or 10 by consensus still, not there for me, but I just think, and adding the second, so you had a lot of options if you went the other way. But I would say for Derrick Henry, this is a good way to let me get a high first. All of a sudden now they're liquid, and now you might be able to go 103 and get other things, or who knows what you do with it, but you're kind of locked in. Not that Henry's going to get someone signing or drafted that's really going to impede his progress this coming year or anything, but just you stay liquid for the next 2-3 months.
Yeah, and I think that as we sort of talk more and more about this, because if you shop that pick around and add to it, you can probably get McCaffrey or something like that, right? You can get into that zone, right? Eckler is a good example, right? I do think, and again, I like as I sit here and keep talking about this,
you might like Fournette. I mean, for example,
more. Right.
Fournette might land somewhere, and you're like, well, I can give 103 for Fournette and a 23 first. Like you might be able to get a deal like that done, and now it's just like you're kind of getting him for free-ish. Yeah. And so that's why if you just wait till free agency and at least have clarity on that, because not many rookies are going to truly challenge a guy with like Fournette's profile, for example, early on or whatever. So, so you do have insulation once we at least get 1 month down the line.
And you have to. The other thing too that I would say about this is you're thinking about this deal. You probably don't have a ton of competition for this deal, right? Because the person at 101, the person at 102, they're depending on how that was earned, right, they might not be willing to pay that because they're not in a win now window. So I think that's a factor as well. You might be bidding against yourself with a deal like this. And if you do this deal, like you have to be in a win now window, right? Because the time's ticking on Henry in a 1 or a 2 year window. You have to sort of be willing to do that. If you're not that, then don't do this, right? Look for
but it's FFPC. I mean, let's be fair, right? FFPC is like at all times you should kind of be pushing your chips in. because
You and I think that.
it's
I don't
tough.
think everyone
All right.
does. You know,
Well,
you and
this whole
I
rebuilding at
agree with you.
FFPC thing. I mean, you're rebuilding maybe for what, a couple months? Like, I mean,
You should be.
it turns in a hurry. So,
Right.
and yeah, this next trade, I actually think it's interesting, and a reminder for FFPC in general. The roster cut downs are coming in about a month, so that is where you're shedding some roster spots. So there's some play there of, do I have more than 14 positional players I want to keep? Do I have less than? Can I actually improve my 14 that I have to keep? So depending on what side of the line, and that was in play for this next one, which was 201 and 402 in a one quarterback for Chase Claypool.
Give me the picks. Give me the picks. Right. I mean, I would say give me the picks because I'm not a huge fan of Claypool. I don't think he's a big time difference maker, and there's a ton of questions with him, and it's a roster spot, right? And I think you can probably
You got to be lean and mean.
replicate him. Yeah. Right.
I will say though, I do prefer Chase Claypool in a vacuum to the wide receiver you can draft at 201 this year.
Sure.
But that's not the discussion we're having.
Right.
Could he break out? Could he be massive? Yes. But having excess at wide receiver and having wide receivers, you have to be very specific, and it might be limited to one player on your wide receiver depth chart at most that you say can't really start him right now. You know, that so you want to have like 4 maybe would be ideal. And so 4 plus an upside guy. And is that, just a guy that hasn't arrived yet, whatever that means. Could be a rookie, could be first, second, third year guy. And so that's where we live. But yeah, like you clear the spot in Chase Claypool, which it sounds valuable, but in FFPC, he's basically just another guy. Unless he steps up into the top 24 or something this year, he's just another guy. Right. And so you have 201. Now, frankly, I do wonder, can 201 get you a lot of places? That would be my biggest question. And I think the answer would be yes, but I don't think that gets you a future first, which would be maybe the ideal pie in the sky. But 201 keeps you flexible for now. And like we said, I mean, before roster cut downs, you save a spot and you at least can use these on, because veterans are mixed in. That's another factor here of anyone cut or anyone that popped up. There's no waivers until the draft. So all these angles are open. So round 2 through the end of the draft becomes like redraft roster building of guys you're not going to have a lot of allegiance, but guys that could be veteran running backs or potentially starting quarterbacks, or you have just a lot of flexibility through that entire gamut.
Right. And now what the Claypool market is. So if someone, if that deal's not made, you can kind of keep that in the back of your mind. If that's a deal you want to make later on, you kind of know what the price is. And the other thing too is if you do this deal now, you preclude yourself from making a deal like this later on at a cheaper price, right? For X receiver that's similar enough to Chase Claypool, but it's a 3rd round rookie pick or whatever, right? Because you're blocking up that roster spot and you're using the pick. So I would stay flexible at this point for all of those reasons.
Doesn't 201 get you like Brandon Cooks easily or Tyler Lockett easily?
I think so.
I mean, yeah. So I mean, again, if you want to stay tight in your 4 wide receivers, those guys fit, as that 3 or 4. Claypool, as we're kind of alluding to, doesn't really fit that team building philosophy. But again, not everyone has the same team building philosophy within certain formats. We got one more FFPC, and I mean, wouldn't randomness have it again? 103 is on the move here. Another one quarterback, and it's 103 for Michael Pittman and a 23 first deemed middle of the road, which again could be hyper valuable or could be lower level valuable depending on the format.
I'm going to kick this back to you because I'm interested to see what you think is going to happen at 103 because I haven't gotten that far yet in my rookie prep.
I gotcha. Well, again, I think in FFPC, you definitely need to angle straight with tractor beams straight towards running back in general, because if you draft a 1st round rookie draft wide receiver, like let's say Rashad Bateman, and year 1 turns out to be, not some massive breakout pointing, beacon of light towards the promised land, that it becomes an interesting keep 14 player decision depending on some of the backup running backs you got in terms of utility. So that's the danger of just taking wide receiver early and it not working out right away. I think you get trapped into keeping them. So that would be my cautionary tale. And so if you are thinking it needs to be running back, and to me, there's 2 running backs, and do they make one of them make it to 103? There's a lot to be said between now and landing spot and draft pedigree and all that to say if they do. And wide receiver, you got to get one that gets up into the top 2. So I personally, but my problem is I wish it was someone different than Michael Pittman.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess I would rather have 103 for now because I know I could get a 23 first plus. And I wouldn't, my biggest takeaway is I wouldn't spend it on Michael Pittman because I think Michael Pittman's a trap player. So if I'm wrong, so be it. But he's the classic. He's done something, but he hasn't done enough. And he's young and everyone thinks he's going to take 1-3 steps forward. And that's a losing proposition, in my opinion, to keep anointing these guys because we remember the hits and we just gloss aside the misses. And so, again, I know you're getting like a first evaluation in Pittman and you're getting a 23 first added. I get that, but I'd rather keep 103 in my pocket. Know that, again, you can get Derrick Henry, you can get Austin Eckler, you can get auto start guy. And if you want a 23 first plus a player, I would just say stay super flexible and say, I can get someone I can start if I want to, a wide receiver plus the first, but stay flexible for now because you still may hit with that day 2 or round 2 running back that you like at 103 at the end of the day at 21 years old. And I would prefer that over Pittman in the first anyway.
Do you think that's running back 2 at that spot at 103?
Yeah, probably.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Superflex you got a better chance, but one quarterback that we're discussing here, I mean, so I think you need a wide receiver up in there, and I don't know if we're going to get it this year. I know FFPC generally drafts running back pretty darn high, and so I don't think there's going to be a lot of running back competition this year. I mean, it may be like 2016 without Zeke, where we had very few day 2 running backs, and then so they're all going to get pushed up a lot. And we may even see day 3 running backs get pushed up to a don't do it, don't touch it with a 10-foot pole, Devontae Booker type level. Or
that's
Kenneth
a terrible idea. Just so we're clear on the
Yeah.
record, this is a terrible idea to take a
Devontae Booker goes 109
running.
and Kenneth Dixon goes 110 in the 2016 draft. But again, part of that was people wanted to take running back, and that's generally a pretty good rookie draft strategy. But there weren't the horses, there weren't the pedigree, and you're taking a guy drifting out to like round 5 of the NFL draft that's in a decent situation, and yeah, they go in the first round. It's like, that's horrific. And it's especially horrific when you compare it to a different rookie draft where you got Alexander Madison sometimes floating out to round 3. That's the difference between classes, and that's the thing. You have to keep a sharp just perspective and historical eye on these things where you can like the player, but it's like, well, the same profile cost a round and a half difference in a different class. So that's preferable, apples versus apples there.
Yeah.
So where are you standing on Pittman? Are you, I mean, again, promising stuff this past year, but do you view him as the classic, this is far riskier than a lot of people think? Or, I mean, do you put decent odds that he could actually be an alpha going forward through his kind of prime years?
I like him, but the problem is like, does he stand out? Right. And that to really value a wide receiver sort of in that range, there's 30 guys that blend together, right? You can go, I mean, if you want to be extreme about it, you can go from CeeDee Lamb to Brandon Cooks, and they finished a point apart this year, right? So what is that, like wide receiver 5 to wide receiver 45, right? They kind of blend together.
I feel like you need to tweet. I feel like you need to tweet something like "Never forget," that Brandon Cooks was within 1 point a game of CeeDee Lamb, despite popular opinion.
No, not even 1 point a game. It was 1 point. Literally one.
Oh, one total point. Okay.
1.0 PPR points different on the total. So, So like again, it's a big time variance range at a position that it's tough to get right, and you're subject to a lot of variance in that range. So, I think that we have a pretty good idea of like, hey, get guys that take a lot of targets, right? If they're a little bit older, that's fine. We the same cast of characters that we constantly talk about are guys that I prefer, and I think we can get him cheaper, right? So I like Pittman for what he is, but I don't have any sort of preference for him versus
he's on the upper band of cost for what he's actually done, which is kind of the problem, because it means it's a lot. Okay, I'm not gonna say all. It's a lot of downside and not a lot of upside when you look at the historical. What's likely to happen, because he strikes me as that perfect storm too. I mean, not to get all narrative and situational, but T.Y. Hilton was a relic, and Paris Campbell was gone for the year essentially, and you know tight end was a non-factor there. What did they have? It was Michael Pittman and complete the sentence. So
Carson Wentz just chucking it around.
yeah, Zach Pascal. Sorry, no disrespect, but you don't count. You do not count in this discussion. So there was nothing else going on. So Pittman, bravo, great job, you produced. But if there was requisite talent around, what happens?
Mm-hmm.
What happens? If he was on Minnesota, what happens?
Right.
I think we know what happens. He gets 70 targets. So that's the biggest part for me is they're probably going to fix that. They're probably going to address that in some form or fashion. And it's going to be in the next 2.5 months. So does he still produce to that level? All right. Let's go over to some quotes this week. And frankly, these quotes could have been an entire show in and of itself. So these are comments on the trades that were discussed this week. Others are just mixed in here. It's always destination and dependent for running backs and for all players, but especially for running back.
We talking about rookie draft?
Just in general. But yes, I mean, if you want to take a landing spot for a rookie, sure.
Yeah, I mean, I we're not great at picking landing spots, so I tend to push back a little bit on that. You know, we try to pick them, right? Kansas City was vaulted up as this great situation, and that wasn't, right? We thought San Francisco was a really good one for a certain Trey Sermon, and that wasn't, right? You know, and then there's situations that are constantly wrong, you know, that Jonathan Taylor can't catch, right? In those types of situations, right? All those things. I think we're pretty bad at picking situations, honestly, right? And just a couple of years ago, no one wanted any part of Stephon Diggs because Buffalo's offense wasn't any good. Josh Allen's coming off back-to-back quarterback one finishes, right? So I think we're pretty bad at projecting those things well in advance. So, you know, I would say landing spot is, if you're playing that game, I think you're probably better off doing it in terms of draft pedigree, in terms of actual profile, and not trying to necessarily project the situations. Oh, it's a great situation. Let's draft the guy that went there. Let's draft good players, because the situation can change in unpredictable ways.
Yeah, and two guys that I think of that landed in like quote unquote blocked situations, like eternally blocked at running back. One was Tony Pollard. Now I'll say he's got a pretty bad run because he really hasn't had any clarified starts. But you know what? He's pretty strongly valued in Dynasty. Like, and what do we keep saying? He could change your season, which is still true. You know, if Ezekiel Elliott were out for the back half of a season, including the fantasy playoffs, who knows where that takes your team. And then the other one was Alexander Madison. He plummeted in the draft because he lands behind in his prime Dalvin Cook. But you know what? He's had how many spot starts now? 3, 4, 5. He had 3 this past season, right? 2 or 3.
I believe so. Yeah.
That were just again monster showings. Just plug and play. We've been waiting for this, and here it is. Press the button, and he produced.
I didn't have to bring out Matty the Axe this year either, you know.
And those are valuable. So just because you didn't get a whole season or half a season, you could get it at any time. You can get these spot starts, and it could be the exact moment your dynasty team needs it. So I wouldn't view that as like just a horrible. And those are, again, the two notables where it's like they're landing behind in their prime stud running backs. And yet still you look at those outcomes because they've proven to be good players that they have either market value or that spot starting value that we've seen in stretches.
Right.
It is more than fine. It is more than fine to keep a player like DeAndre Hopkins as long as your overall roster has enough youth. While youth is the key to a good dynasty roster, if you want to win a title, you need some vets who are on the back nine. But constantly chasing youth, you may not win as much as you should.
There's a lot of contradictory statements in that, would be what I would say. I agree with the idea that you don't necessarily have to chase youth. I don't think championship teams have to be driven by youth, right? I think that, you know, it's nice when they are, but I don't think they have to be, right? And so that would be my thing on that is you can take, right, productive players can come from all different aspects, especially if you're playing super flex, right? You can be, you know, you can be quote old at quarterback and be just fine, right? You can make a really good quarterback room out of quarterbacks that are older than 34, that are 34 or older right now. You can do a really good job of that, right? And at not an expensive cost either, which is pretty wild. Back-to-back MVPs, right? Super Bowl champion Matthew Stafford, right? Kirk Cousins, who's constantly underrated. Just those guys alone, right? That's a decent room at not that expensive of a price. And so, yeah, I mean, do I like to backfill? We talked about this earlier. Do we like to backfill with the young guys when we can? Yeah, but it's not, right? I think that's, the end is to win, right? That's the means to the end. I think some people put being the young stud, good-looking team as being the end goal, which to me it's not, right? I know it is to other people. It's not to me, and I don't think it is to you. And that's probably has changed to some degree in my dynasty experience. So I would be careful about, I think there's a lot in that statement, but I'd be careful about, thinking that youth has to fuel a championship, because I don't think it does.
Well, whether you're young or on the older side with your roster, we're all doing the same thing here in February and in the offseason in general, which is thinking, how can we improve our team to win this coming year? Whether you won, finished third, finished ninth, whatever it was this past year, you're still trying to do the same thing, which is win the last game of the season next year. So I would say that if you're on the older side, I still haven't really seen, and a big part of it when I have seen it go this way has been they were bad profile bets. And when people sold out in this variety, but I've yet to see someone age out across the board and turn from highly competitive to horrible. I have not experienced that. And one of these other quotes was just about, I would love this group of wide receivers, and maybe I'm too focused on age, but I'd be concerned about aging out all at once. And it was a team of like Keenan Allen, Mike Evans, and they had, I think it was DeAndre Hopkins, and they had one younger guy. And they were pointing out that he sold the younger guy for some package or something. It's like, and they couldn't really imagine being stuck, quote unquote, stuck with like 28 to 30-year-olds as that's like your wide receiver core. And so they're worried about all those guys aging out at one time. And the odds of that are relatively slim. So I would just go back to the beginning part of our show where we kind of talked about how, the price gets lower every offseason. So to validate, if you didn't like selling Mike Evans last offseason and you still like Mike Evans, like why would you sell for 112 this offseason? It's
going to be even worse.
And next offseason, why would you sell for 207? Like I don't,
right.
Why? So every step of the way, I think it gets harder to sell and just saying, well, I'm just going to hold. And if you want to get younger, you're going to do that by maybe drafting a rookie or trading a running back for a younger wide receiver. You're going to do it a different way. It's not going to be Evans for, Kadarius Toney. You're not going to do a trade like that just to get younger.
Right. You shouldn't. You definitely shouldn't. And I think that we probably overstate the necessity for sort of elite wide receivers, or especially young wide receivers, to win. I'm working on some projects right now. A lot of, we talked about it with Pittman, right? These guys blend in, right? So if they're going to blend in, why are we valuing them high, right? If so much is what's going to happen at wide receivers, we're subject to variance. Why value it? Because it's kind of unpredictable variance. That's kind of a lot of the work that I'm looking at right now is leading me to the same question in a lot of different ways. I think you got to be careful doing that, So valuing things very high, sort of in that range, I think it's a dangerous thing. And you can replace wide receivers. You can, right? You can do that. You can, yeah.
Well, here's an example. You probably thought if we rewound the tape 12 months and you go, well, my top two tandem is DK Metcalf and AJ Brown. Well, they both finished in the wide receiver 20s. Yeah, they finished in the wide receiver 20s in adjusted points per game. Did they matter? No, they blended in. Heck, Michael Pittman was right along with them. Right in that same per game impact zone. So those two guys, again, that wasn't the answer. That wasn't the Konami code for 2021. So if you don't get it and yet you paid a super premium to have those younger guys, they're in the same bucket. You get to September and November and you're setting lineups. They can underwhelm just like any other. Now, are they insulated in the market? Sure, they're hanging on a lot better than if DeAndre Hopkins. See how the last 12 months treated him when he finished in the 20s. So that's where there is a divide in terms of that. But, who's a better bet to finish higher this coming season. I mean, based on their price, you would think that the odds are 90% Hopkins, 90% AJ Brown versus 10% DeAndre Hopkins, and those aren't the odds. So there's some, some game probabilities there going on. We got one more, and it's back on the Derrick Henry side. I think getting ahead of Derrick Henry this offseason is wise. He'll be a lot harder to sell in 2023. Cue up Jordan's quote. Here it comes.
Which quote's this, Chad? I'm not the 2023 class.
No, it's going to be you technically don't have to sell then either if you don't like the price. And you say, well, if you put up a strong season in 2022, are we going to care?
Yeah, and there's different cycles through this, right? I don't know if the market's clamoring for.
Wait, there's an in-season market? Are you saying Derrick Henry could be sold not just in the offseason, but in October? Is that possible?
Totally. And, there's risks that go along with that, but also there's upside too, right? And the other thing you don't know as you sit here right now is you don't know if you're going to be competitive, right? And so I think if you're ruling that out, that he could be a part of your championship team right now, I think you're doing it wrong. I really do. And there's so much, I started to look around, and I'd be curious what you think of this, because I think at any given time in most of your leagues, there's probably only 9 people contending or trying to win this year, right? I think a quarter or 3 out of 12 teams are probably not.
Well, that's why, because if you're in it, you're like, you make the playoffs a lot because there's teams notably trying not to make the playoffs.
Right. And so I think, you'd be surprised. And I tried to do this last year. I had a team that had Adams. I had a whole bunch of pieces on it that I was just like, I'm probably not going to contend. I spent all offseason trying to sell them. Couldn't do it. And then I was second in the league in points by I just missed the point title, right? Because everything kind of just, they all played well, shockingly, right? These players that no one was interested in played really well.
Despite my efforts, I ended up contending.
Right. Shucks. And so I think that when, you if you're doing this now, and that's not to say never trade a productive player now, but if you're just bailing on guys because you're like, oh, I could lose in a year, you could blow the pick too, right?
Well, you say this, you say right now, okay, I don't think I can contend with my team. I better sell them now. And then you end up not contending because you sold them.
Right.
And then now when you're in season, you have guys that are producing from the waiver wire, guys that are spot starting and all these types of things. You sell those guys too, because you're like, well, I'm trying to lose. Right. But yet if you combined what you had in season from the waiver wire and doing all that due diligence with what you sold in the off season, boom, you're contending. Boom, you're there. You're there in the final few weeks of the season. You got a chance. Right. And it's just interesting that it's a total mindset thing. But I love what you said, because really in a 12-team league, it may only be a sampling of 9 or 10 teams that are going for 6 spots. Right. And those are better odds than out of 12. It's not 50%. Now you're up to 60%, 65%, 70% of my chances just by showing up and competing.
Right.
And saying, how can I try to rub these sticks together, even if things aren't going well?
Right. And we understand, and the other thing too is there's a whole lot of luck and change that goes along too. If you get in, right, there's a lot that can change. The other thing is, don't underestimate the changes you can make in season, whether that's waiver wire, whether that's trades. And some of my best trades happen in season, which typically was never true until the past year or two. You can really get discounts on guys that are on the opposite side, right? So if you're on the buying side of Henry, right? I bought Devontae Adams for essentially Mac Jones, which would have been, if you had fast forward 6 months, or rewound 6 months, would have been 110 for Devontae Adams. There's no possible way that I could have done that, right? No one was going to do that with me in March or in April or in June. May, right?
That's the flip side though of someone saying, I've got to get younger. I've got to get some young piece that could be an anchor point, and I'm willing to give any of my older stuff. That's the flip side of that deal. That has to be the mindset.
Yeah. And don't rule that out, because if you play it well and you build from depth and you sort of can make good deals and put yourself in a position to be there in October or November, don't underestimate the ability of other people to make bad decisions in the trade market where they're selling Zeke for a future second or whatever, and all of a sudden, like, you can actually add, right? By doing this deal now where you're bailing on Derrick Henry, again, you can trade him. It depends what the cost is, but just by bailing on him now, you rule out other options, which would be something that I'd be cautious about, because I want to keep as many doors open as I possibly can in terms of my team direction at this point in the offseason.
My last point that I was thinking about in the Derrick Henry vein is, okay, so you pass right now. So, or you make the trade. But what I would say is the data points you have. So right now we have basically none. We have no free agency. We have no NFL draft. You especially don't have any data points of injuries from August through the end of the season. You don't even know what your record is after 4 games. You know nothing. You know nothing. You have your roster and you kind of have some preconceived notions from last year. But as we get closer, you get through those pivotal NFL checkpoints in the calendar. You get more data points. But when you start accruing a record, yes, you have the risk of Derrick Henry, A, falling off, B, having a season-ending or career-threatening injury at his age or whatever. You have those factors. And I think that's what people fear the most, that he's going to be hurt at the time where I start not contending and I got to get out of this business. So that's what people fear the most. But what I would say is, well, what percentage chance do you put on that? A, not contending, and B, Derrick Henry is hurt, or something some combo like that, and it's around Halloween, and I'm 2-6. Derrick Henry is not producing, and now I want to sell this albatross, and I can't do anything. So that's worst case scenario. What if you are contending? What if Derrick Henry is producing well? What if one of those two things is happening? Because you know what? I'll say this. If you're contending and Derrick Henry is just okay, let's say he's like running back 12. And it's like, well, that's, one of his worst per game seasons in a while, of just like, he's falling off, but he's still a starter for you. But let's say he's not a driver, but yet you're 5-2. Are you going to care that 6 months ago you didn't trade Derrick Henry? No, you're 5-2. You're in competing mode. You're not thinking about that. Henry's in your lineup. He's not a top 3 guy or anything, but he's in the mix. He's starting for you. You're putting him in every single week. And so I don't think in that scenario you look back and you're like, still wish I traded Derrick Henry for 104. Like, I don't think you're going to do that. So I just think even if the cost is less, when you finally have more information and you get to October and all these things align and you're like, time to sell Derrick Henry, and you sell him for what turns out to be like 109 next year, I still think that waiting period is better than trading it for like 104 now, because you got all the way and you checked all the boxes for saying, now it makes complete sense for me to maybe click this button. You still don't have to, but I just think you get all the way there and it's worth the few spots you lost in the draft or waiting the year on the rookie pick, because you got so many more points. I know I stink, or I know Henry's not a part of my plans. And now I'm accelerating to the next draft class where I can hopefully stay flexible again.
Yeah.
All right. Jam-packed episode. And in this episode, mentioned a lot about FFPC format, talked about Derrick Henry, Michael Pittman, how to value picks, and some of those roster cut downs, Chase Claypool. And the show started about age. And frankly, again, age becomes part of our discussion every single week in some capacity for your dynasty team building, in terms of how they're valued during trades. And something Jordan mentioned, which is very important, which is arbitrage, similar profiles, and looking how the market, you can exploit that with maybe similar profiles that produced at requisite ages, or maybe differing in ages. All right. So I am Chad Parsons. He is Jordan McNamara. And until next time, good luck in your dynasty leagues.